All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started with Skillful Talent Series Edition 4, focused on employee retention. This is part of a series. And if you haven't been to the other ones, that's okay, because we're going to do a recap. Skillful is a nonprofit initiative of the Markle Foundation. Markle comes to Indiana from Colorado, and they have been hired by the Department of Workforce Development, Indiana DWD, in partnership with Next Level Jobs to basically do employer education and bring some innovation to the way that we are attracting, training, and retaining talent in the Hoosier State. This is a SHRM certified training. So this is worth 2 professional development credits. If you are SHRM CP or SHRM SCP and you would like to receive that credit for attending today, by all means, reach out to me after the session and I will get that code to you. So real quick, a little bit about me. My name is Chad Carruthers. I am a SHRM CP. I work for CareSource, which is a managed care entity, a nonprofit that serves 2 million members, including in Indiana. We administer the Healthy Indiana Plan and Hoosier HealthWise. So Indiana's Medicaid offerings. I've been doing various HR-related roles for about 20 years now, especially in talent acquisition, kind of front-end stuff. Right now, I am doing workforce development for Medicaid as part of CareSource's Life Services, which is our brand of social determinants of health, or SDO, which is essentially everything that affects your well-being that doesn't happen inside of a doctor's office. So some of those are more obvious, things like food security, but some other things are not as obvious, but definitely do affect your well-being. Things like housing, childcare, transportation, and especially employment and education. So that's where my focus comes into play in the program that I work for, which is called Job Connect. So that is a part of our life services offering. And this is a test drive of a series of workshops that we are thinking about adding to our employer education toolkit. I have over 200 employer partners across the state, and I travel the state, or at least I did pre-COVID, and hopefully soon post-COVID as well. Traveling the state, touring employers, helping connect talent to opportunity, like Kelly, and building these relationships and doing some employer education to help bring innovation to talent acquisition in the state of Indiana. So that's why a healthcare guy is talking about workforce development. We see social determinants of health as being the future of healthcare, really focusing on the person outside of the patient, and what affects your well-being more from a social standpoint than employment and education. So that's what we're doing. That's where my stake in this is. In the talent series workshops, you are here, number 104, and we focus on today on a skills-based approach to career development and advancement. Hint, spoiler alert, it's not just about raises. It's not just about direct reports, putting people underneath you. In fact, I have no direct reports, and I have actually not been promoted even once in the last 4 years. Not even once. And I think that's great. And I'm going to tell you why I'm so content in my role, despite having no one reporting to me and not having been promoted even once. And we hit on some of this in the chat as we were getting started. The role that I'm in plays to my strengths. I have a tremendous amount of flexibility to adapt my role to the needs of our members and the needs of our company, to adapt to the mission. I have been held up as a SME, a subject matter expert, in 2 distinct social determinants of health roles company-wide. So people come to me from all over CareSource in all of their 6 markets for help with certain topics. CareSource makes a huge investment in development, and especially what we refer to, if you're a SHRM CP, you might know the term job enrichment. That is huge at CareSource, and that's one of the reasons why they've been able to keep me. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So you are on workshop 104. So you might be thinking, uh-oh, I'm not sure. I haven't attended any of the ones before. Let's put a poll up and just kind of see where we are. Let's take the temperature in the room here. Have you attended any of the previous workshops? So Skillful 101, 102, or 103. Go ahead and answer the poll I've got up on the screen and let me know. Okay, most people have answered already, and the overwhelming majority have not attended any previous workshops. That's okay. I'm prepared for that. We're going to do a recap before we get into new material. So we have a handful of people that have attended at least one workshop, but the majority of the people in the room haven't attended any. So that's fine. That's okay. That's what I needed to know. Also, then it becomes super important to let you know that I emailed out a spreadsheet to you that you're going to want to have open on your computer. So I sent this out in a calendar invite yesterday. So go ahead and make sure that you can access that spreadsheet. If anyone needs it, go ahead and say so in the chat, and we'll try to get that to you. Okay, we have some folks who need the spreadsheet. So I just put that into the chat. So you're going to want to have that spreadsheet open on your computer. Make sure that you pick edit mode so that you can actually type into the spreadsheet. Also notice that there are a number of pages in this spreadsheet, a number of tabs. So at the bottom, make sure you are on the leftmost tab, the one that says hiring guides. That's the main one that we're going to be in. If at any point you guys need that spreadsheet, just let me know. It should be in the chat for you right now. Okay. Also, in case you haven't figured it out already, this is super informal. At any time, if you want to ask a question or if you have a comment with the caliber of people that we have on the call today, I'm really hoping that we can talk about some of the retention ideas that you guys have. So please, at any time, unmute yourself. You can interrupt me. This is super not formal. So ask questions, add your comments either in the chat or verbally. Totally cool. Would love for you to do that. So that spreadsheet that I emailed out is filled out with the example, a sample position of recruiter. And we've used that for all of these workshops. After today's workshop, I will send you links to the recordings of all of these workshops. And I'll also send you a blank version of the spreadsheet as a template so that you can use that if you so choose to actually put a skills-based approach into practice. So, again, to recap, in 101, we talked about redefining our positions from a skills-based approach. So writing a job description and then a job posting. In 102, we talked about creating tools for skills-based screening, interviewing, assessment, to sort of standardize the processes and to reduce bias as well in the hiring process. In 103, we talked about selection guidelines. So how to keep your process of choosing candidates based on meeting specific competencies. And today in 104, we're going to kind of pull it all together to talk about retaining employees through competency development, advancement, how to better invest in employees so that these skills can impact retention and close the skills gap. And again, I'm going to want to hear for your ideas too. So I like to kind of start out by talking about traditional hiring practices using the example of recruiter. We're going to use this sample position throughout these workshops, including today. So if you will, consider that there are about 3.4 million people in the labor force in Indiana. Let's say we're looking for a recruiter. So let's talk about our talent pool before we even get to specific locations within the state of Indiana, before we even talk about specific degree requirements or specific roles within HR, or even if we talk about competencies. Let's talk about the first thing that we might see on a job posting is degree required, right? Well, that in Indiana, that's going to eliminate about 3/4 of folks who do not have a college degree. So let's say that you have maybe 852,000 people statewide that you could possibly shop that position to, right? Then let's say there is inherent bias in your job postings, and we're going to talk about that here in a minute too. And you eliminate another 30%. Now you're down to about 600,000 candidates. Now let's say that you require specific HR and financial resources experience. That is going to eliminate most of them, including me. So this is where I like to mention that I myself am passionate about this topic because I am a product of skills-based hiring. So my backstory is my first career was actually in public broadcasting, in public radio. So my degree, the only degree that I have is a journalism degree, so communications degree. And so out of college, I went to work for a public radio station and put my journalism degree to use. But I ended up in a very different role in the organization. I ended up essentially managing the human capital of the organization. I did a lot of recruitment, training people, placing them into roles that best fit them, training them, managing them, and doing performance evaluations. And eventually I was promoted to the manager, the director of that organization. And found that most of my work was really HR work, even though I didn't have any formal training in that, didn't really have any background in that. That's just what the needs of the organization called for, as we had hundreds of volunteers and a roster of paid staff as well, and managing the human capital of the organization. So when I eventually burned out on that for reasons that we're going to talk about today in retention, I had to kind of do some soul searching, and I met with some folks in workforce development, HR, to kind of assess where I had been in my career and where to go from there. And so as I was talking to people about what I actually did at my public radio station, talking about attracting talent, placing them, training them, managing them, and evaluating them. Several of those people said, "Dude, you were in HR. You were basically the HR manager for that organization." I never thought about it that way. So we reframed my resume and my background as in an HR context. And sure enough, the next job that I got was in an HR department, and some of those folks are actually on the call right now. The folks at Blue Green Vacations, who know, even if they don't know the term skills-based hiring, they've done it. They put it into practice all the time because you guys did it with me. So even though I didn't have an HR degree, you saw from my work history and demonstration of competencies that I had done that type of work successfully before and could channel that experience and those competencies into a talent acquisition role at Blue Green. So I know that we have some folks on this call who, even if you don't know the term skills-based hiring, you're doing it. You're doing it already, and you've done it successfully. So that's my story of how I became a recruiter, a HR generalist technically, but I focus mostly on talent acquisition there without a specific HR degree or any kind of labeled experience. So I myself am a success story of skills-based hiring. So this material really resonates with me. So you can see on the slide here that using traditional hiring practices, 99% of the Indiana labor force would be excluded from the position that I got at Blue Green, including myself. So here's the key slide in defining skills-based hiring. So the difference is credential versus competency. So credentials are typically degrees, achievements, qualifications, work experience, certifications, all good stuff, but not necessarily indicative of skills that someone possesses. Using credentials is very common because it feels easier to communicate expectations of skill level, but it's not as clear. So credentials have some implications involved that the employer can assume that a candidate with a specific degree has mastery of certain skills, right? Well, we all know that's not necessarily true. When I went to college, my parents told me college is what you make it, right? I'm sure that you've heard that before. And so everyone has a very different experience in college. Some of us take it very seriously and come out of it with skills mastery. And some of us, including me for the first year or so, kind of party our way through college and don't necessarily come out with mastery of the skills. So using credential approach eliminates those other pathways, like the pathway that I took into HR and then workforce development. So it's exclusive and it's limiting. And I am keeping an eye on the chat. I see Andrew said that he is also a product of skills-based hiring, and so he had theater training. His background was a theater training. Similar comment from Kelly that she's a product of skills-based hiring as well. Thank you guys for being engaged and active today. I really appreciate that. So let's take a look at competencies then. So competencies. So some of you know the term KSAs, right? Knowledge, skills, and abilities. So these more accurately reflect a candidate's ability to perform specific activities and complete tasks, and they're inclusive because they don't prescribe a specific way, a specific degree or a specific job that you had to have in order to gain that skill. Again, case in point, myself. I learned most of my HR type duties on the job because I had to, because of the organization that I was involved in. So regardless of how competencies are learned, candidates who have the right competencies are qualified for the position. That's the point that we're trying to make, credential versus competencies. I also want to mention briefly, some of you know the term soft skills and technical skills. So taking a skills-based approach kind of rebrands those as well. So soft skills, that term can kind of be misleading. So we are now rebranding that as foundational competencies. And technical skills, what we used to call technical skills, we want to refer to those as occupational competencies. So those are competencies that are specific to a position or an industry. So for example, in IT, coding. If you work in manufacturing, specific manufacturing processes, those are occupational skills for that. Patient care, if you're in healthcare, clinical roles, patient care would be occupational. And it's super common for companies to hire primarily for occupational competencies, especially more technical positions. But the thing is, you can train most of that. So especially in our experience of recruiter. So if you look at what we've got on the screen right now, under occupational competencies for recruiter, employment law, applicant tracking systems, recruitment strategies. I knew very little about employment law before I got into HR. I had taken like a one-day seminar on, crash course, absolutely what you need to know on employment law. But I was much stronger in foundational competencies, and those are a lot harder to train for. So those are the KSAs that you want. Those those are the ones that are transferable from industry to industry, but harder to hire for unless you're being super intentional about the process. So again, going back to my example with the folks at Blue Green that are on the call today, if I had been judged on my knowledge of employment law or familiarity with a specific applicant tracking system like UltiPro, I probably would have been overlooked. So skills-based hiring, to kind of summarize it up. So first of all, we want to remove credential requirements whenever possible. Work experience, degrees. Now sometimes you can't. So for example, we do have some healthcare people on the call today. So for example, a CNA, clearly you have to have a CNA license, right? So for jobs that truly require credentials, if you're a lawyer, you have to pass the bar, right? You have to have your bar license. If you do truly require a credential, you should use the credential and competencies. So it should never be just a credential. So removing credential requirements when possible, that's super important. Also using competencies that are specific to the job. This is super important because the same competencies are going to be used throughout the entire hiring and retention process for consistency and long-term success. And then finally, a nice side effect that I'm seeing in skills-based hiring is reducing bias. So by implementing a skills-based approach, we are also integrating methods to reduce bias when we screen, when we interview, when we assess. It helps get rid of the isms. So racism, ageism, classism, those are the big three that I see all the time, especially now that I'm doing workforce development for Medicaid. I see examples of this all the time, and it's just heartbreaking. And sometimes we don't even realize what we're doing. So I'm going to show you an example of that. So on your screen right now, you have an example of a qualification list for a recruiter, what I would call a pedigree qualification list. So I want to give you a second to take a look at this. And I wonder if anyone on this call sees any problems here. So feel free to talk in the chat, or you could just unmute yourself. If you see a specific word that's bothering you or a specific phrase, go ahead and tell me what's wrong with the qualifications here. Okay, so Kelly Maxwell says requiring the specific degree, bachelor's in a related field. Specific ATS, yes, Beth, thank you. Those of us who have worked in UltiPro and this one's asking for Workday, they're 95% all the same, right? It's not that hard to adapt from one to the other. So why are we requiring a specific ATS? Absolutely great point. So yes, those are big ones. The year of experience too. I mean, so it's like 364 days is not enough. So somehow on that 365th day, I become magically qualified to work as your recruiter. There's some other issues here too that might not be as obvious. So some of the wording, some of the word choices, the vague terms that are suggestive of skills, but don't actually know. Yeah, okay, Leslie, internet proficiency. Okay, so what does that mean? Exactly what is proficient? What does that mean? Here's another one, analytical skills. So this is one that you might overlook because it's totally innocent. But did you know that there is gender bias in the term analytical skills? And the reason I say that is because, and studies bear this out, men tend to overestimate their own analytical skills. Women tend to underestimate their own analytical skills. It's true. Kelly points out urgency too. Yes, that what does that mean? That's super vague. And then words like energetic, confident, dynamic. So in those words, there's age bias. So when let's say you're an older person and you see a term like energetic and confident and go-getter, if you think anything, you're going to think, oh, that's code. They're saying they want a young person. I don't have that energy that I used to have. Same thing with dynamic. Dynamic, it has culture bias. Because there are plenty of cultures that are much different from American cultures, where being super extroverted and dynamic, and it is actually frowned upon, and is considered disrespectful. So and some of these words that we're not intending to have bias in here. It's just kind of creeping in because of poor word choices that are not super clear because they're not skills based. So let's take a look at what we did in workshop 1. I'm going to give you a minute to read this. So workshop 1 was all about revamping, overhauling to a inclusive skills-based qualification list. So take a look at what we've got here. So notice there's no credentials. Again, for some positions, CNA, lawyer, you got to have them. Also notice the distinction between required and preferred competencies. So that gives some clarity to the job seeker on what's most crucial for the job. And also for us in HR, it shows us where the wiggle room is. These are the must-haves. These are the wants. Now, if you open that spreadsheet that I sent you, I hope you all have it opened on your computer. There's a copy of it in the chat. You should have it open now. Go to the leftmost tab, Hiring Guides. Here you'll see the very first thing that we did is we built our competencies for the recruiter position. We're going to use the recruiter example throughout the workshop. So you'll see we came up with 11 competencies that we felt were relevant for recruiter. We ranked them. We categorized them as occupational or foundational, whether we could train, and whether they would be required or preferred. So how did we do that? Well, some of it was from the workshop 1 content, but also we used 2 very cool websites. And I will send you these links after the training, but you want to make sure to bookmark these. So number 1 would be builder.skillsengine.com. So this one, you can plug in a current job description. Like you can literally just paste in your job description and it will analyze it for you. The other one that we used is generator.skillful.com. And we might actually use that later on today. So let's say that you want to build a skills-based job posting. You can simply just type in recruiter to here, and it will get you started on that path. So we use these 2 websites. So builder.skillsengine.com and generator.skillful.com. And here's what we came up with. So we have these 11 competencies. We ranked them. We ended up dropping the 3 least important and focusing on the 8. 5 of them required, 3 of them preferred. So that's how we got where we are right now. So this is part of my recap here on how we came up with competencies for the sample position of recruiter. Now notice that not only did we identify these 8 competencies, but we also defined them. So let's look at that process real quick too. So going from identifying to defining competencies, what we want to do is put them into context. We've already overhauled from credential-based to skills-based. Now we're going to use a formula, which, to be glib about it, would be do something to achieve something. So we're gonna have an action verb, what you're going to do it to, and what you're going to achieve. So you notice here I've zoomed in on the 5 required competencies. I brushed the preferred ones off the screen for right now, because early in the hiring process, we're screening out people that do not have our required competencies, because those are deal breakers, right? You got to walk in the door with at least a minimum proficiency in these 5 competencies. Later, we're going to use the preferred competencies to rank our preferred candidates that we already know have the required competencies, and we're going to screen in. So we're going to screen out early, screen in later. So you can see, to zoom in on this a little bit more here, do something to achieve something, right? So communicating to candidates and to the person who is hired what's expected in the role, and allow them to self-assess against the competency needs for that position. So for the hiring team, this helps too, because clear definitions gets us all on the same page. So it makes sure that HR and the hiring managers, we're evaluating candidates based on competencies, and we agree on that before the hiring process even starts. And notice that they are outcome based, not behavioral based. So outcome focused definitions focus on transferable competencies and how they meet the needs of the role instead of behaviors. So we want an action verb, we want an activity, and we want an outcome. So for example, you say that your most important competency for your recruiter is interviewing and assessment. Okay, so that is the ability to develop structured interview guides and assessments to analyze applicant skill sets. Process improvement. This is a big one for recruitment. To support the recruiting process and sourcing methods, to improve quality of candidates and reduce time to hire. Super, super clear. And also notice that by using those outcomes, we can then later measure that, right? So we say here, reduce time to hire. Well, you guys in HR know that's a metric. We can measure that. We can measure time to hire, and then we can compare time to hire before this person was in the role and time to hire after, right? So this sets us up for success in what we're going to talk about later today. So that was all workshop one. Workshop one. So switching gears now to workshop 2. So we've switched to skills-based competencies. We know exactly how to define a job position based on a skills-based approach. Now we need to set up skills-based screening tools like assessments, and how to screen resume, how to look at a resume and screen it for skills. And especially, we're going to talk about interviewing because it's so often done poorly. Interviews often judge people on how skilled they are at interviewing, as opposed to evaluating the actual skills that they need for the job that they're being considered for. So many times we see this approach resulting in someone being hired because we like them, instead of necessarily being the most qualified candidates, even if we have the best of intentions. So we want to evaluate competencies instead of fit. And we want to use assessments to get rid of that subjectivity in the process. Now, I hear from employers a lot of times that interviews are useful for assessing culture fit. And I disagree with that basic premise, because that doesn't assess whether someone can do the job. If you're using interviews to screen for culture fit, I would really recommend you rethink that approach. Because what I have seen with the companies that I've worked with these last 4 years is that the ones that have the best culture are the ones that have a culture add approach, So those companies view the diverse background of a candidate as bringing something new to the organization, instead of trying to fit them into existing cultural norms. They're enriching the culture of their organization. And then that culture grows and evolves. So by focusing on skills-based interviewing, we're more effectively assessing if the candidate has the right skills for the job, but also reducing that subconscious bias of hiring people that reflect our own personal experiences, our own pathways to success. So with interviewing, the main thing that we talked about was leveraging behavioral and situational questions. So behavioral questions focused on past behaviors, right? What did you do in the past? So the tell me about a time questions, right? Tell me about a time in which you had to blah, 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 blah. Situational questions are the same, but hypothetical. So how would you use a specific competency in this situation that I'm giving you? So what would your process be? So for example, we're gonna ask you to improve our job postings. What would your process be for that? So behavioral and situational. We also want to focus our questions on specific competencies that are evaluated either by an interview or by some other step in the assessment process. We want to avoid multi-part questions. Interviews are already stressful enough. It's difficult to answer a question that includes multiple layers and angles, and really difficult for an interviewer to assess and evaluate a candidate fairly when there's too much in the question. And finally, all interview questions should be inclusive and reduce bias. Questions that, for example, ask about someone's personal life and their interests, those are common entry points for bias in the process. Those are the so-called icebreaker questions, right? So tell us about yourself. You know, what do you do? What do you enjoy doing in your spare time? Seems like an innocent way to get the dialogue going, but this is not skills-based. So there's no behavioral or situational angle. You're not asking about a specific competency, and you're just opening yourself up to bias. So we recommend that you transition from those traditional questions to a skills-based approach, particularly behavioral and situational questions. So tell me about a time in which you had a difficult time filling a role. How did you adapt? Blah, blah, blah. So what competency are we evaluating there? It's process improvement, right? Which we indicated was our number 2 competency for our recruiter position. So I'm going back to the spreadsheet now. So if you're in the spreadsheet, we're on line 45 in the spreadsheet. Again, if you need that spreadsheet, just ask. And you can see that we are now evolving from those 8 competencies to where and how we're going to ask about them. So I provided you with at least one situational or behavioral question that covers all 8 of those competencies. As we near the end of the screening process, remember how I said we're going to move from screening out to screening in? So this is a great time to use some other tools other than interview questions. Interviews have their limitations, right? So even if you're taking a skills-based approach to interviewing, the quality of that interview still depends on the candidate's ability to talk about their competencies. Not everyone's good at that. Sometimes you have the competencies but don't know how to express them very well. So work assignment is a great example of a different screening tool that you can use to go beyond the conversation and ask the candidate to demonstrate their competencies. It's a simulation, basically, right? Show me. So we start with a preferred competency because at this point, we've screened out people that don't have the required competencies. So for example, you might have noticed one of the preferred competency for recruiter is persuasion, right? How well can you persuade candidates at job fairs or whatever. So to create a work assignment, we want to describe a task that this competency will be used to do routinely. So for example, for persuasion, you might have your recruiter write persuasive LinkedIn messages to do passive recruiting, right? Maybe you're going to get on LinkedIn and look for people that haven't applied and encourage them to apply, right? So for this job task, we want to use this simulation to test their persuasion. Obviously, if they're writing a message, then writing is also another competency. So we do have 2 competencies that we're screening for in this work assignment. And we're going to ask them to write a persuasive LinkedIn message. So you'll see this in the spreadsheet as well. Applicants will be provided an overview of a position and asked to write a persuasive LinkedIn message as if they were recruiting it. So you will see now we are on line 77 of the workshop spreadsheet. That's what we did in workshop 2. We created some screening tools. So then moving on to workshop 3. skills-based selection. So once you know your competencies and you've audited them to be skills-based and you've got your screening tools that you're going to use, now you need to carry that process forward to use a skills-based approach to choose people. So how to judge which candidates best demonstrate the needed competencies. So we're going to rely on evaluating candidates based on validation of competencies instead of major achievements and degrees and what titles they've had before and what degree they got 20 years ago. Those data points are, again, not always the correct indicators of success. They are often proxies. So we want to use skills-based selection to validate those competencies. And it also brings the hiring team together, because then we have agreed upon expectations on which to evaluate interviews and assessments, so that there's no discrepancy in the rankings and what's important for the final hiring decision. So this also helps eliminate bias in the process, because one thing that I see employers say is that they reduce bias by bringing on a diverse panel of people. Well, we're gonna just pack the panel interview with people of all different backgrounds and types. But that can actually add to the problem, because you're just bringing more cooks into the kitchen and they're not looking at the same recipe, right? So without clear expectations, adding more opinions is just going to compound the bias. So what we need to do is align our hiring team around consistent expectations. So set clear expectations of skill levels and defining how that skill level should be demonstrated. That's going to get rid of the bias in our process. So selection guidelines. For example, let's carry forward this example of the LinkedIn message, right? So on the competency of writing and persuasion, we're evaluating a candidate based on how well they can do this LinkedIn message work assignments, right? So what we need to do then is create a scoring system. And this is going to help us score candidates for each competency. It's pretty common to use a 1 to 5 scale, right? So that's like, excellent, good, fair, poor, terrible, something like that, right? The exact numbers are less important than the consistency of the scale. So within each score, then we would define what a 1 to 5 means, and we would break down that competency into components. So for example, let's look at this rubric for persuasion right here. So this is on line 96 of the spreadsheet, by the way. I'm still referring to the stuff in the spreadsheet. So for the competency of persuasion, what does that mean, right? So just like in that original job description, urgency, right? What does that mean? So here we're going to break it down to what we expect when we say persuasion. So we decided there'd be 3 components of that. So grab attention. Obviously, you need to do that if you're going to persuade someone. Connect, make a connection with the person reading it. And authenticity, be genuine, right? We see so many of these passive recruiting messages that seems really fake, and it's almost like a robot wrote it, right? So this is a rubric. That's what we call it in academia anyway. I have a side gig teaching at IU at Indiana University. And the course that I teach at Indiana University is a journalism course, again, pointing back to my history in public radio. And I constantly have to grade students on very subjective criteria. So they're turning in writing, they're turning in news stories, right? And I have to evaluate them. And much like we see in panel interviews, one person's idea of good can be very different from another person's idea of good. So we have to do this at IU to standardize our grading practice and make sure that we're doing it fairly. So this might look overwhelming, but you can break it down. So you can start with just the 1 to 5 score and define what that means broadly, and then work your way into coming up with these specific components. And I tell you, this will greatly reduce bias in the hiring process. So we did this in workshop 3. So we had the message that you see on your screen right now. We evaluated the sample message. And first we did it without a rubric, and then we did it with everyone using the same rubric. Guess what? Not surprisingly, we were much more on the same page after we were all using a rubric to decide what's good and what's not. Once we have a rubric and know how to use it. Now, this is in your spreadsheet too, but it's not on the main tab. There's a tab called WA Guide for writing assignment guide. It's on that tab in your spreadsheet if you want to take a look at that. Now let's go a step further and do a little bit of weighting. WEIGHT, weight like heavy, right? Not waiting around, but weight like heaviness. So maybe you decide that some of your proficiencies have a different minimum acceptable score. So for example, for required competencies, you've got to set a baseline, right? Candidates have to walk in the door scoring at least this minimum to be qualified for the position. But maybe for preferred competencies, maybe there's a little wiggle room there. Maybe if someone scores lower on a preferred competency and they ace all the required competencies, maybe we would still consider them. Maybe that they could be trained, because preferred competencies are often occupational competencies, which can be more easily trained. That really depends on your team and how much bandwidth you've got to train on that particular competency, and how badly you need that specific skill level, right? So the capacity to invest is going to impact where you set the minimum on there. But again, we're defining, what is, okay, writing, persuasion, urgency, what do these things mean? Let's break them down to measurable levels and decide what we need to see and just get on the same page. So writing is a required competency. Maybe we're going to hold steady at 3, but maybe for persuasion, maybe we would take a 2 because we could train for that. These are the kind of discussions you have to have before you score even the first candidate. You've got to figure this all out. So then you can use this same methodology for any stage of evaluation. You might find it most helpful in the interview stage. Because again, how many times have you thought that a candidate totally flubbed an interview and then you turn to the next person and they're like, oh, I thought that was pretty good. So this is from your spreadsheet as well. So there's a tab in your spreadsheet called Interview Guide, where we laid out some samples of this, where you can create a rubric to give to everyone involved to get us all on the same page. So we bring it all together with a score sheet. So this would be sort of a master scoring guide that puts all of those values from each candidate side by side. So now you can kind of see, okay, I think we're starting to figure out who we want to hire here, which candidates are the top, and also which training needs to be carried forward, right? So we are looking at number 2, candidate 2, and we're thinking, well, they have the top score. 2 and 3, candidate 2 and candidate 3 are pretty close. In this case, we're going to decide to go with candidate 2. And we've identified that the weak spot for this candidate is persuasion. That's a preferred competency, and we decided that we were going to allow a minimum score, a below minimum score of 2 instead of 3 to go in. So we want to hire candidate 3. Congratulations, candidate 3, you are hired. Now it is time to onboard and do long-term development. So really getting into the meat of today's content. Companies miss a huge opportunity when they do orientation and call it onboarding. Most of the time when we're talking about onboarding, people refer heavily to the administrative aspect of it. It usually takes the front seat, but that's really just orientation. Onboarding, new hire paperwork, those are not the same things, right? Onboarding involves a lot more than just getting them their badge ID and giving them the tour. The goal is to develop a plan that's relevant to those needs that are apparent from that score sheet we just looked at, and make sure that they get up to full productivity as quickly as possible, and then provide a plan to develop them long-term. So skills-based onboarding focuses on developing their skills, identifying where the gaps are as they come into the company, how to upskill and going beyond the first 30 days or the first 60 days or the first 90 days. We want onboarding to be long-term and systemic. So here are the 4 key components. You want to make sure that there is some aspect of all 4 of these in all of your long-term onboarding plans. Training, we're going to look at that one most heavily today. Formal training for competencies. We are also going to make sure that there are coaching and mentorship opportunities. This is very important for your internal learning, peer-to-peer learning, supervisor coaching, to know how to adapt competencies to the actual job, interpersonal relationships. And we're not just talking about relationships inside the company, but also external partners. What relationships are needed to be successful in that competency? And then, of course, administrative. I mean, you do have to get them their logins and get all the paperwork in order, but you need all 4 components to create a clear and supportive onboarding process and provide a significantly improved process for you and for the new candidate. So you can see, looking back at the score sheet for candidate 2, we already know before we hired them where those weaknesses are. So we can do a full onboarding plan that addresses and boosts those lowest scores that we saw. We want to cover all the competencies, but we're going to sketch out a plan to help this new hire specifically with where their weak spot was. So here is row 105 in the spreadsheet, where we've already gone through over 100 rows in the spreadsheet, and we are on the section where we come up with at least one thing that we can do to support the new hire in all of those competencies. Notice that we really want to look first at company specific, like insider knowledge. So if someone's coming into the company from outside, you don't know what you don't know. Right? So what internal resources are provided? What's unique about how the competency is used at your organization? That information helps identify where a new candidate is going to gain the most from your internal onboarding. So this is line 105 in the spreadsheet. And then you'll see also there is a tab in the spreadsheet called Onboarding Guide. This is the rightmost tab. So you may have to scroll the left to right scroll arrows in order to see it, because there's a lot of tabs in that spreadsheet that I sent you. So you'll see this is the onboarding plan. The onboarding guide, we're going to put in every competency, the step needed to get the new hire up to speed, which category. We want to make sure all 4 categories are covered. As we move into new material in the workshop, we want to keep this employee and nurture that development, right? So we've already invested all this time and money, but did you know a recent Gallup poll, so LinkedIn did a poll with Gallup and found that only 7% of workers receive proper career advancement. That means 93% of people feel like they might have to leave the organization in order to get ahead in their career. Not surprisingly, internal hires outperform external hires. It takes outside hires sometimes as long as 3 years to perform at the same level of an internal promotion. And one of the main reasons that people leave their job, lack of career opportunities. So if you provide development, you increase retention. And then, like I said, it's also about money too. So we hear all the time from companies that we don't have the money to invest in training. But the cost of turnover is often much greater, but it's hidden because it's in the recruitment process, right? But you can actually spend, on average, 21% of someone's salary in order to refill that position. There's actually a calculator in your spreadsheet for this. It just basically takes the salary times 21%. So I have a question for you guys. So at your workplace, what is a typical salary for a role that is constantly needing to be filled? So I just launched this poll. So tell me, just give me an idea of where the salary range is for a position that you are constantly having to recruit for at your company. Okay, I'm seeing the $35,000 to $45,000 range seems to be winning. right now? Most people are saying 35,000 to 45,000. So let's go on the low end of that. So 35,000 times 21%. So that's $7,350. Each time you have to refill that position because of turnover, you could be spending as much as $7,350 to redo that, right? So here's an interesting stat for you. On average, in the US, companies spend only $1,300 per employee on training and development. So you could spend 3 or 4 or 5 times that amount on training and development and still be saving money compared to the cost of repeatedly recruiting and training, right? So if you think about it that way, and if you frame it to the C-suite in that way, you might get a little bit more leverage in showing that there's more to lose financially as well as staff morale, but financially, because numbers talk, by not investing in employees, right? So our final objectives for today is we want to carry forward the lessons that we've already talked about to development and advancement. Things like career mapping, get you thinking about how to sketch out a map of your organization to determine where possibilities for advancement. And then within the context of those possible areas of advancement, create some methodology to develop competencies toward those career goals. So that's what we're going to finish out with today. So traditional development is often gap-based and reactive. Oh, we got to put out a fire, oh no, something's come up and we've got to react to it, right? And it's also inconsistent too. I mean, you may have folks in your organization that say they feel very well supported in terms of training and development, and others that say, no, I don't really get that. So we want to make that inclusive and kind of standardize that. We want to be proactive to make sure that we're focusing on the goals of the organization and keeping it competency based so that we can assess, track, and support development. So number one most important slide for doing that is retention, right? An overview of different levels of skills-based development. So I'm going to pause on this for a second so that you can read this. Obviously, the top row, onboarding, the goal is to get a new hire up to full proficiency, but then look at where we go from there. From onboarding, we go to stretch assignments, job enlargement and job enrichment, and finally, advancement and promotion. And we're gonna break this down. I'm gonna come back to this slide actually at the end here in just a little bit. So let's talk about choosing options for skill development. So we'll do some just kind of brainstorming here. We'll break into groups for a few minutes and see if we can come up with ideas. So let's talk about external training options. Things like e-learning, super popular now, even more so with COVID. Local training institutions, maybe you have a community college or another local educator, and sector-specific training. So for example, in HR, the SHRM learning system. I spent most of last summer studying for my SHRM CP certification. There's a tremendous amount of material available through SHRM. So let's give it a shot. Let's come up with some external training options, at least one idea for our 3 preferred competencies that our new hire scored low in. So I'm going to give you guys 5 minutes in small groups. You're going to have the spreadsheet open to row 129. So using this recruiter example, and its 3 preferred competencies, I want you to come up with one idea for each one of these for external training. So we're going to do that next. So let me break you into small groups, and we'll do that for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and see what you guys came up with. So let's do breakout rooms. All right, we're going to do 5 breakout rooms for 5 minutes. See what you come up with. Again, row 129 in the spreadsheet. And the rooms are open. And we are back. I apologize. I'm not sure I gave you guys the full 5 minutes. I think I might have cut you off a little bit soon on that, but I'm sorry about that. I thought that the close room warning was 2 minutes instead of 1. But let's see what you guys came up with. So for external development options for recruiters, so recruitment software. So either in the chat or you could just unmute. Who came up with a good idea for an external learning option for recruitment software?
Hello?
Yep.
Yep. So our group came up with contacting the developer of the software, because a lot of times they may have someone from sales or possibly even IT that can kind of walk you through some of the tips and tricks behind using the software.
Yeah, absolutely, Kelly. Thank you. Okay, so e-learning. E-learning available through, and in this case, we use Workday. This particular employer uses Workday. So yeah, there are e-learning modules, and all the recruitment software programs, all the major programs have their own e-learning options. So great, that's perfect. So for persuasion, so where would you send someone to learn persuasion? Does anyone have any good ideas for how to externally train that competency?
I said Sandler sales training.
Yeah, okay, great, Neil. So I have been doing a lot of LinkedIn classes. So LinkedIn, being that people use LinkedIn for passive recruitment, there are actually some options on LinkedIn for external training options. So awesome, great. What about employment law? Did anyone get that far? I know I cut you off a little soon. Did anyone come up with an external training option for HR legal stuff?
We talked in our group about, I work for a nonprofit, so this was my suggestion. If there are any board members that are attorneys or HR experts, they might have resources for good training on employment law, or at least the basics of employment law.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. That's great. In fact, we're going to go back to those people when we look at internal options here in just a moment. So that is a great segue. So thank you, Leslie. I would recommend SHRM learning modules again for employment law stuff. They have a ton of learning modules, especially what SHRM calls the book of knowledge, the SHRM book of knowledge, which is kind of ominous sounding, but it's the main training program for SHRM CP and SHRM SCP. So yeah, excellent stuff, guys. Let's talk about internal options because those are actually even more important. So things like coaching and mentorship, cross-training, and what we're going to close out with today, stretch assignments and job enlargement and job enrichment. So now thinking about those 4 things, experiential learning. So it's all great to go to a webinar, or workshop, or a conference, right? But have you ever gone to a session like the one that we're having right now, and then gone back to your job and be like, okay, so what do I do with that, right? So you have to have that experiential learning angle so that people can take an external training and then apply it to what they learn on the job. So this might get more specific to the organization, and you might go to people like Leslie just talked about and maybe have direct contact with them and learn directly from them as opposed to just asking them where to go externally. So we want to go internally now. So thinking about that, let's put you back in your groups and think of an internal training options. So think about coaching and mentorship. Think about stretch assignments. Think about mainly coaching and mentorship. How can you partner a new hire with someone to get that company-specific training for recruitment software, persuasion, and employment law? So let's go back to the breakout rooms, and now we will do internal options. And here we go. And we are back, and let's see what you guys came up with. So for internal development options, what is an internal option to help someone get up to speed on the recruitment software that you use at your company? How would you do that at your company? Any ideas on that? Someone's talking. Who's got an idea?
Job shadowing someone. So maybe seeing how that person does that job and also have a package where they're able to look through the software, learn it that way, but also be able to ask questions while they're doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Okay, so some cross-training, right? From someone who uses the software already, maybe from the IT administrator that manages the software for the company. Awesome, great. What's an internal training option for persuasion?
This one, our group came up with role playing.
Okay.
Role playing with a senior recruiter or manager.
Yeah, I love it. Love it. Okay, so that's basically what I thought of too, is some coaching and mentorship from a senior recruiter on applying passive recruitment techniques. What about employment law? How would you get someone up to speed? Let's say they've done the external learning and now they have to figure out how to apply that at your specific company. What would you do to bring someone up to speed internally on employment law stuff?
Maybe have them look at specific situations that have either happened recently in the organization where employment law had to be applied, kind of like that. What was the situation? What were the laws that applied and how did we work through that? And I suppose it could also be, theoretical, like propose things that didn't really happen, but could happen. And kind of have to do scenarios.
Yeah, you're right on. The first thing that you said is exactly what I kind of came up with, Leslie. So case studies of previous issues that have actually come up before. So sit down with the HR manager, HR director, compliance officer, whatever, and look at, okay, all this law stuff is very theoretical, but what has actually come up before that? How can we apply this in an actual real scenario, right? Great stuff, guys. Great stuff. Okay, so we're in the home stretch now, looking at promotion, basing promotions on competencies instead of performance in the current role, using a system and being inclusive about it. That's where we're going to end for today. Is we're going to talk about mapping your organization. So let's look at this little circle for recruiter and think about what does the map look like for your organization. So you might start with just the bubbles that are closest to the recruiter, right? So maybe senior recruiter, maybe D&I, maybe learning and development, maybe they aspire to be the HR manager. So maybe those would be roles that don't have an enormous gap in skills, maybe just a little bit higher. But I really want to get you thinking about opportunities all over the company. So roles are not just restricted to the HR department. You could add in a few from other departments that could present opportunities for the recruiter. So think about this, and there's actually a section in the spreadsheet where you can do this, rows 135 to 140. So I want to show you what I came up with for that. So within our company, I thought of some different categories outside of human resources. So operations. So for example, now at this point, you really have to get the employee to say, where their objectives are. This is largely up to them. So selection of a specific role should be determined based on the employee goals. But let's say for today's training that the recruiter has really enjoyed the process improvement competency, and they've done a good job of using that competency in recruitment, and they want to apply that competency beyond the HR department. So for something like that, if you've got a recruiter who's really interested and good at process improvement, where else in the company could you advance them to? So many companies have something called a business operations specialist that basically audits practices, policies, contracts, and tries to save time and money and be more efficient, right? So that might be a good fit for our recruiter who's super into process improvement, right? So the next thing that we would do is we would look side by side at some of these competencies and how they compare with each other, right? So presumably for business operations specialists, you would have gone through the same process that I showed you today for the competencies for recruiter. You probably have that same sort of thing applied for business operations specialists. So now we can kind of do a side by side, and we can identify where are the competencies the same and where are they different. So for example, and remember, you can always use that Skillful page, generator.skillful.com, to come up with competencies. So this is also in your spreadsheet where I came up with some kind of left to right. And we can see some of them adapt very easily. Things like process improvement, interpersonal skills, judgment, decision-making, persuasion. Those are all competencies they're going to carry over to business operations specialists. But some of them don't. Some of them need to be modified slightly, like writing. Writing's going to be for a slightly different audience. But some of them are completely different. So they're not going to use employment law. They're not going to use recruitment software. They're going to have different competencies that they're going to have to use. Is that okay? Can we map a plan for that? Or is this too much? Is this too different? So when it's too different, then we get what's called the Peter Principle. So if you promoted a recruiter straight to business operations specialist, just based on their performance as a recruiter, they're going to struggle. And historically, promotions are granted based on the success an individual's having in their current role. And that doesn't guarantee success in a future role. So this is the Peter Principle. I used to work in a nonprofit where promotion was based solely on seniority. I saw this happen again and again and again. I called it being promoted to your own level of incompetence. I myself was eventually promoted to the director of the entire organization. Guess what happened? I left. I did that role for about 2.5 years, and burnout wasn't for me because my competencies were not developed and it wasn't something that I was interested in. So we need to do this process to make sure that we can first stretch before we exercise, right? So a stretch assignment takes that new role and tests out our recruiter's ability to develop, let's say, their writing competency. So in this case, we need to come up with a stretch assignment that takes our recruiter's already identified skill and competency in writing and stretches it in a new direction. So currently the recruiter is probably already writing. They're probably writing those LinkedIn messages. They're probably writing job postings, but they don't currently write contracts or agreements. So that's a great use of a stretch assignment, because that'll give them an ability to use a competency we know they're already decent at and just stretch it in a different direction. So here's something that I came up with. for a stretch assignment. Let's say that the business operations specialist, we know they write contracts. So we want the recruiter to try this out by writing contracts that are still within the HR department. So maybe a contract with an external staffing firm or a community partner that's going to send referrals to us. That would be a great way to kind of stretch it out. Let's say the assignment goes well and you want to enrich or enlarge the recruiter's responsibilities in their job description. This is a key part of growth because then you can track it and you can include it in their performance evaluations. So in red, you see here, I am proposing that we take that successful stretch assignment and we just make it a permanent part of this recruiter's duties. So moving forward, they're going to do this new duty. Now, it's very important to understand the difference between job enlargement and job enrichment. So enlargement is just throwing more tasks at someone. Enrichment is really what we want because that builds depth. And the key is that these extra duties that you're adding, they involve more control, more responsibility, and more discretion. If you just throw more work at someone without them being able to see that these new tasks are giving them more control, more responsibility, and more discretion, they're just going to burn out. They're just going to say, hey, you're just asking me to do more work for the same amount of money, right? So we want to make sure that we are following this process as we wrap up today, the experiential learning process, onboarding, stretch assignments, job enlargement and enrichment, and advancement and promotion. In the couple minutes that we have left, I know we're almost out of time. Does anyone have any thoughts that they want to offer on what works for you? So at CareSource, we do sponsorship of SHRM learning. We do SME designations. In public radio, we do a lot of job rotation. At Blue Green, they did something called the LEAD program. And if anyone from Blue Green wants to talk about that, I would welcome that. Does anybody want to offer any final thoughts on what works for you? Uh-oh, crickets. Are we burnt out? I tell you what, I'm going to follow up with an email that has a copy of the blank spreadsheet, all these links, and I'll send the email unblinded so that everyone can see everyone's email address. And if you guys want to use that as a discussion thread, we could do that too. If you want to follow up and email everyone and say, hey, here's something that we're doing that puts these skills into practice, stretch assignments, job enrichment, any other ideas that you have, I would love to hear those. So at any point, absolutely reach out through email. There are a ton more resources at skillful.com/employers. Tools, templates, articles. Remember that Skillful job posting generator, generator.skillful.com. That is an awesome resource. And finally, if anyone would like to talk more specifically with me about my program, Job Connect, if you're not already partnered with us and you would wish to be, then absolutely reach out to me. Again, I will send everyone a recording of today's workshop along with previous recordings. I'll send you a blank version of the spreadsheet and we can follow up as needed or as desired. So thanks so much. I especially appreciate all my employer partners being here today. Please go forth and practice skills-based hiring. I appreciate you and we will talk to you soon. Take care, everyone.